My name's Steve Bass. I'm the independent chair of the ESPA board. I must first present apologies from Paul van Gardegen, ESPA director. He would really love to have been here this week, but he has family issues and he's had to go to New Zealand. Hopefully he'll send us a message later. I know he'd love to be here. We've all got a lot out of these conferences over the years. I've enjoyed the last year in New Delhi and in London before. So welcome. Welcome to this rather fabulous piece of British establishment. This is the large pension room. I think the closest most scientists will ever get to anything called large pension. So enjoy it while you're here. I'm really happy to have with me a couple of representatives of the ESPA board, the three donors to ESPA, Department for International Development, Natural Environment Research Council, and Economic and Social Research Council, who've joined me in trying to deputise for Paul. First of all, I'd like to pass over to Katherine Wright from NERC.
Thank you, Steve. For those of you who don't know me, which I think is just about everyone in the room, I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Natural Environment Research Council, NERC. As Steve said, we are one of the organisations which fund ESPA. And all I wanted to do this morning is to welcome you, both those who are here in the room and those who are watching live, and also just stress how important ESPA's work is to NERC. I'm very pleased to see that outside on the table there are copies of the NERC strategy, which I did not arrange, so thank you for whoever put them there. And our overall goal, our overall vision, is to place environmental management at the heart, environmental science at the heart of responsible management of our planet. Our goal is to essentially make sure we understand the planet so that we can benefit from it and ensure not just that we benefit from it, but that future generations will also be able to benefit, that we are preserving the planet on which we all depend. So you can see that the goals of ESPA are absolutely central to that vision. And in fact, we've identified in that vision 3 specific particular challenges of benefiting from natural resources, resilience to environmental hazards, and managing environmental change. And ESPA helps to address all of those 3 challenges. There is an infographic which I was recently sent by the ESPA Secretariat, which showed that the publications of ESPA are increasing rapidly, and that's great, and that is a sign of success of the program. But the real success of ESPA is going to be in the impact that it has in not just our lives, but the lives of other people on the planet and the future generations, and enabling us to tackle what I think is probably one of the greatest challenges of this century, is how we can ensure that everyone on the planet has a decent standard of living without destroying the planet in the process. So that's really all I wanted to say, that we think ESPA is a fabulous program and really important, and I hope you enjoyed the conference. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about the work that's being done myself. Thank you. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Andrew Clayton from the Department for International Development.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'd also like to welcome everyone here on behalf of DFID, and many thanks for participating in the conference. You probably most of you won't know me. I took over as the DFID lead for ESPA about 5 months ago. So this is a great opportunity for me to meet the ESPA researchers and find out more about what you're doing. ESPA is a very important program to DFID. It's our largest investment in environmental research. And there's a lot of interest within the organisation, including country officers, on the evidence that ESPA is producing. We had a recent annual review of ESPA within DFID, and what came out very strongly is the high-quality science that is being produced within ESPA, and that really struck me, having sort of reviewed a large number of DFID research programs. And I think particularly when you look at the quality and quantity of peer-reviewed publications coming out, it's a real credit to all the work that you've done. Also, for us, it's a good example as well of successful collaboration between DFID, NERC, and ESRC in both supporting high-quality research and also research that will have an impact on development. For us, it's both about the importance of the quality of the science, but also we're quite a demanding donor in DFID because we also want to see development impact. And I think there are already good examples coming out of the ESPA program where we've seen real influence on policy and programs. And I think as we move forward to the remainder of the programme, I think this will be an increasing priority. And I'm very glad to see that tomorrow you've got a panel session on development impact, and I know the IPAG is meeting on Friday, and we'll look at that. So I think that's very important to us. I think there's a real opportunity for ESPA to influence the SDGs and the commitments that donors and governments have made to the SDGs, and providing evidence of how we can better do that. So that's what I really wanted to say. I mean, this is a science conference, not to hear about DFID policy and programs. So I'll hand back to Steve and say how much I'm looking forward to hearing about the research that has been going on within ESPA. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome. Just to introduce the agenda, part of the context, of course, this year, Sustainable Development Goals having been agreed, universal, integrated, transformative. I mean, we use words like this when we set up ESPA, and it's a great opportunity for us to fill the space as people wonder what to do with the SDGs. Another part of the context for this year are words that we on the board have been using for the remainder of ESPA, words like synthesis, legacy, and impact. How do we impact the SDGs? How do we impact national development processes? So these will be in our minds this year. And in fact, we're thinking maybe next year's science conference ought to focus on those issues of legacy, impact, institutional change. Part of the context as well is this sort of Chancellor's statements today. You were kind of modest there, Andrew. You didn't mention the scores that ESPA got in the DFID review. Let's say they were pretty high, which is really encouraging. The aim of today is to share the breadth of new evidence on poverty and ecosystem service links, to reflect on what this means, particularly in terms of the context, SDGs, are we building the right integrated institutions? To think a little bit about what we do with this research, and tomorrow we'll be talking about how we synthesize it and how we take routes to impact, as well as what gaps might be still in place. I have to say, though, looking at the agenda today, a lot is covered. We're still characterized by breadth. Some of the presentations are on interdisciplinary method and modeling and data. There are many on different sectors: agriculture, forestry, water, energy. Quite a few on development processes, national and local. Innovations there and more integrated approach. And on conceptual frameworks. I think Belinda's going to talk about social and ecological systems and resilience, for example. And all of the work, I mean, I noticed when looking at the agenda, is deeply rooted in humanity. And it's been quite impressive how each program has really got to grips with the needs and aspirations of particular groups. So it's still very broad. It looks like a magazine more than a kind of focused agenda. There's probably a prize for anyone who can see a rationale for the clustering of the different talks, because I can't, but if you do, then let me know. So it's still very broad, and we're going to talk tomorrow about synthesizing and focusing for next year. So how will it work? I remember the last 2 years of Science Conference, it was a bit like a Ryanair flight. Those of you who are not from Britain, this is a very cramped budget airline, and every single seat was taken, and some people were a little bit more expansive than allowed, which made it rather uncomfortable. It was a very full agenda. Unfortunately, in some ways, some people have had to drop out this year. They're not coming on the journey with us, which gives us a little bit more space, but I would still implore that people try and stick to their allotted time. Otherwise, we get that standard symposium problem where everyone kind of overflows and you get panic over timing. So the Americans have their Liberty Bell. I've got the ESPA Equity Bell. And here it is. I'll give everyone a 5-minute warning, but when their time is up, you'll hear this. Now, this is a kind of Tibetan way to bring peace in the room. And if you disobey this call to peace, there'll be real trouble. So when you hear that, I'm afraid everyone has to stop for the purposes of equity. One of the other reasons for the purpose for trying to achieve equity between us is that we're being live web streamed. Now, there's nothing worse than getting up at 5 in the morning because you want to hear Dr. Smith and then find you could have got up at 7 o'clock. So anyway, welcome to those who are listening, wherever you are now. You'll be able to listen to this afterwards too. So after the plenary, which is for up to 45 minutes and up to 15 minutes discussion, all the other talks will be 20 plus 5. Although those of you doing 20 minutes, think how much more fun you'd have if it was 18. Then you get 7 minutes discussion, high-value feedback. You see what I'm getting at here. At the end of the day, because we will have been timely, we get rewarded in true legal fashion with extremely early drinks. 4:45, I think the drinks can start, and they'll be starting close here. So anyway, that's broadly how it works. And I will start by introducing Belinda Reyers. We've got 2 keynotes this year. Belinda has an expansive 45 minutes. She's got a great depth of work on social ecological systems, resilience. She's from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which presumably does what it says on the label. So, Belinda, over to you. Would you like this, or are you Madonna-style, mic'd up?
Not quite Madonna, that would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Colleagues, you may want to sit at the front with me.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve and Andrew and Katherine, for setting the scene so well. As Steve said, I am from the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Stockholm, Sweden. But as you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm actually a South African, recently moved to Sweden, and all the work I'm going to be talking about now is actually work that we're doing in South Africa, where I keep one foot firmly planted. It's a real privilege to be here, and I wanted to thank ESPA for inviting me to join in on this conference and to give this talk, both to those of you sitting in the room, but also those of you sitting somewhere on computers listening in. It's a remarkable venue to be talking in, a little intimidating. I'm not sure if I'm on trial or whether I'm the judge. And also due to some of the technology of live streaming, I'm working between 2 laptops, so forgive me if something goes out of sync during the next 40 minutes or so. So when Paul approached me to give this talk, he asked me to spend a bit of time reflecting on where we've come from as a community of ecosystem service researchers and practitioners, and where we might be going to, especially in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the broader global development agenda that Andrew was referring to as well. And in terms of that, November has been a rather bumper month to think about some of these things. It started out with the meeting of the Programme on Ecosystem Change and Society, their first conference in Stellenbosch in South Africa. This was a program that was set up following the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to start addressing some of the research gaps, data gaps, and knowledge gaps made evident through the MA. And very short on its heels was the Ecosystem Services Partnership Conference, also surprisingly in South Africa. Funny how many European institutions want to have conferences in the South at this time of the year. And this was a very big conference. It was the 8th conference of this group, attracting more than 400 academics and practitioners. Now we're here in London as another iteration of that community focused in the development and poverty alleviation context. And in the background, our Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is probably keeping you all very busy with demands for reports and assessments and looming deadlines with their plenary coming up quite soon. So definitely a month in which we've done a lot of thinking and talking about ecosystem services, where they've come from and the journey ahead. And this gave me quite a bit of time. I just wanted to show you this photograph. This was taken at the conference in South Africa. And I think I could show you lots of photographs to show the absolute explosion in the ecosystem services arena. I could show you the exponential increase in number of publications, new journals, new acronyms, and new students being trained. But I think this photograph captures very nicely the sort of enthusiasm, innovation, and energy that exists in our community that grows probably each month these days. And so while I was sitting in all these different conferences and listening to all the wonderful work that's going on in very different aspects and dimensions of ecosystem services, it was useful to start thinking a little bit about where we've come from. And my journey of ecosystem services began during the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2000, which serendipitously coincided with me handing in my PhD and being selected as one of the young fellows in the Millennium Assessment under the very kind and forgiving mentorship of Georgina Mace, who many of you may know. And the Millennium Assessment was a pretty good way to start getting introduced to the ideas of ecosystem services and to meet a very interesting group of people working on this, over 1,300 scientists from around the world who were well known for working very hard and dancing very badly, as you can see in that photograph, which was taken during the closing ceremony of the Millennium Assessment at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005. For some people in the room, this journey may have begun even before that, in the community of Diversitas, for example, that began in the early 90s to look at building an international network of biodiversity scientists. That too is a photograph taken at their closing ceremony in Spain just over a year ago, as Diversitas moved into the new big global platform of Future Earth. But what is very clear is, following on from the MA, the absolute proliferation of activities and programs like TEEP, like your program, ESPA, the Natural Capital Project, and all the work that they've been doing in the development area. Also, the Convention on Biological Diversity, more and more starting to bring in an ecosystem services lens into their 2010 targets, as well as more recently into the Aichi targets. And I think throughout this whole journey, it's been interesting to watch our connections and convergence with the development agenda, especially the global development agenda, beginning as far back as in Rio in '92, and then really coming quite centrally into our field in the Joburg Summit, the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals giving us some slight traction within the environment goal, but I think very excitingly, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals approved a couple of months ago, really opening doors, I think, for our community to engage much more with both the accountability and reporting on those goals, but also, more importantly, in their implementation in the countries and locales in which we work. And so this really forms some of the backdrop to a lot of what I will be talking about this morning is these Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to be looking at the 17 goals in particular, but more the intent and the words that Steve was mentioning around universality and integration, which I think we offer a lot in terms of the work that we're doing in all our various projects. And so, in terms of structuring the next 45 minutes and making sure everyone stays awake and I don't fall asleep as well, what I thought to do is to reflect on some key dimensions that I see the ecosystem service community has expanded in over the past, say, 10 years, 10 to 15 years. And I use the word expanded rather than shifted because it's not a case of an either-or focus. It's just a growing inclusion and expansion of a plurality of things that now are involved in the work that we do. The first one is the one that Steve mentioned already, the fact that we started out, many of us, in a very sort of disciplinary way in our work, focusing on ecology or biology or the conservation disciplines, and how that grew through processes like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to start engaging with other natural sciences, with the economic sciences, and increasingly with social sciences and the humanities. And we can see that in many of the projects within ESPA. But not only have the number of disciplines really changed and expanded, it's also been the way we've worked with other disciplines. From sort of a simple multidisciplinary approach where we would bring different disciplines together, bring our knowledge, write different chapters of the same report and staple them together, to a much deeper level of collaboration, of cross-disciplinary generation of actual new knowledge through the bringing together of multiple disciplines. And I think to the final one, the sort of building of an actual new discipline, an interdiscipline of ecosystem services, which is informed by and informs underlying other disciplines that we're all engaged in. So a real expansion, and this is very evident to me in the ESPA domain, but increasingly so in these other communities of ecosystem service research. At the same time, I think we've also kind of tracked a similar expansion in the number of sectors with whom we work, beginning very much focused in the conservation and biodiversity sectors, very focused on the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, growing that focus to include more the environment and water and similar sectors and conventions in our engagement with climate change and with degradation conventions. And now these days focused a lot more, I think, in the production sectors of agriculture and forestry and fisheries, and really working hard to think about how ecosystem services are relevant in the management practices of those sectors. And now, of course, the doors of development sectors are not much more open to the work around ecosystem services. And we see that in programs like ESPA, but we also see that, I think, in the development planning space in many countries, where ecosystem services are now increasingly gaining traction in national development plans, national infrastructure plans, etc. And this obviously has a lot to do with our thinking around the Sustainable Development Goals. Another dimension, I think, of significant change is the way we've engaged with stakeholders, beginning kind of in a very simplistic and superficial way around inviting participation and some review from stakeholders, through to more informed ways of engaging with stakeholders and keeping them informed, through to much deeper levels of engagement with stakeholders involved in projects. And I think these days we're seeing very deep collaborations where the sort of boundary between scientist and stakeholder is becoming less and less obvious in much of this work. And I know that Christo Fabricius will be talking a bit more about this tomorrow. And finally, I think a big expansion has also taken place in the values or the perspectives or the framings with which we see people and nature or social and ecological systems. And I've borrowed the words that Georgina Mace used in her paper last year on the way we've gone from kind of a focus on nature for itself, a very biocentric focus in our work and philosophy, through to nature despite people, the idea that we should protect nature from people, through to a sort of appreciation of the fact that nature could be for people, a more anthropocentric idea that nature was there for its utilitarian values. And I think now to a kind of much more broader appreciation of these multiple and plural values in recognizing nature and people and the links between the two. But now, moving forward and thinking about these dimensions, I really want to not necessarily spend time going through each one. I think that would take way too long. But what I want to look at a little bit is the two themes that I think link these shifts and expansions in our work. The one is the complex systems perspective, or the social ecological systems perspective, and the other is the way our work is becoming more solutions and practice oriented. And I think these both are reasons for some of these expansions we've seen in the various dimensions of our work, but also they themselves have helped, have been informed by these expansions that have gone on in our work. So they're both a cause and a response in some ways. There are many other themes that would maybe be emerging for some of you, but these are the two that I'm going to just use to structure the rest of this talk. All right, so what do I mean by a systems perspective? There's a hang of a lot of literature on complex systems, on social ecological systems, some of it pretty daunting to make your way through. But what I get from that literature really are two key things that I think are relevant. The one is thinking quite deeply about the interactions and feedbacks between social and ecological components in systems. And the second one is starting to become more conversant and comfortable with change, both slow change and rapid change and dynamics in these systems. So what I'm going to do is just go through these two kinds of ideas around the systems perspective. I'm going to briefly touch on some of the theory, but before you fall asleep, I'm going to try and show you some examples of how that's being made practical and more real, I think, in some ways from some of the more abstract theories. And I'll be using some examples from our work in South Africa and some of them related to the ESPA projects in South Africa. So the idea that we're talking about systems, and systems really mean that we're dealing with multiple components and their connections with each other. This doesn't seem like such a far stretch for most of us sitting here, but actually if you follow the conversations that have gone on around the Sustainable Development Goals, it is actually a remarkable paradigm shift that has seen us move from the sort of three separate silos that must be thought about, the environment, the social, and the economic, to a much more sort of overlapping notion of the pillars of sustainable development and the connections that they have. And I think more lately in the SDG conversation has been this idea of a more embedded picture that social systems or that economic systems are embedded in social systems, which in turn are embedded in environmental systems. And I think, although this seems really obvious to all of us, it's not so obvious in many other arenas of work in the development space. And sometimes that can do us a bit of a disservice, assuming that it's obvious when it's not always so clear. And one can see a bit of that confusion between the 17 goals and the interlinkages between them. But I think what the systems perspective actually does is it pushes us even beyond this idea of embedded separate systems to intertwined and inseparable systems. A real recognition that considering the current scale of the global human enterprise, there are no ecosystems that don't have a social component or a human impact or a human influence. And there are no human, social, or economic systems that don't have a link to ecosystems, be it through food and water or through the more nuanced interactions we have with our environment that many people are not really aware of. And it's this thinking of the intertwined nature of the social and ecological or the human and environment systems that I think is front and central to what is meant by the systems perspective. And what this does is it shifts a bit our way of thinking about ecosystem services. I think many of us came into the field of ecosystem services kind of seeing ecosystems providing something to social systems and social systems in turn having an impact on ecosystems, but as two very separate entities in an almost linear way of seeing these things. But in fact, the more we think about and understand ecosystem services, the more aware we are that they're actually a result of a co-production of social and ecological components interacting with each other, producing the ecosystem service. I struggle to think of an ecosystem service that doesn't involve some sort of social factor, be it a demand, a need, a perception, a governance arrangement, a capability or capacity to manage a system that then doesn't have some impact on the ecosystem service itself. And so this is really a systems way of thinking about ecosystem services that starts thinking about them more as sort of emergent properties of the interactions between social and ecological systems rather than a gift from the ecosystem to the social system. And so this is all something we've been thinking a little bit about and writing a bit about these more sort of social ecological co-production. I can't use the word co-production because that means something else these days, but the social ecological co-creation of ecosystem services. And I just put up some pictures here of the kinds of ecosystem services that a lot of us work with in our work. And just to show that there's always some sort of social factor, be it a fence, a grazing management regime, a pathway in a forest, a bit of coastal infrastructure, a waterway or a beehive, and some bee management that is going on within all those ecosystem services. So really bringing the social factors front and center into our thinking and understanding of ecosystem services. Which is great and lovely in theory to sit and have big brainstorming sessions on all of these things. But I think the challenge with a lot of the systems thinking and systems perspective is that sometimes it seems so abstract and so fuzzy, and one struggles to think about how you make that tractable and practical in the work that we do. And I don't think it actually is that hard, and I think we're actually making some good progress in this area. And I wanted to go through 4 areas where I think the systems perspective is deeply influencing the way we understand and also start managing landscapes and seascapes for ecosystem services. So the first way is the point that Steve referenced around conceptual frameworks. Those of you who write papers and read papers must probably be a little sick to death with conceptual frameworks because there's no shortage of them. But they're actually very important practical tools for working together with policy and practice in trying to develop a common understanding and a common language about the system or about the concept of ecosystem services. On the top, you can see from your left, in a very blurred fashion. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with the resolution. It looks great there. We've got the Millennium Assessment Conceptual Framework, which took about 3 years to agree on, followed by the TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Conceptual Framework, which was very focused on being able to quantify and value the benefits from ecosystems. And then on the far right, that's the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, their conceptual framework, which was published this year. The thing about all those conceptual frameworks is they are quite linear. They look at how pieces of ecosystems provide benefits to pieces of social systems which have a value. And they've been incredibly powerful for helping to understand ecosystem function and ecosystem structure links to benefits. And they've also been very powerful as ways of quantifying and measuring ecosystem services. But we've also seen an expansion now of new kinds of frameworks, the one here on the bottom left, which is a much more social ecological and kind of integrated way of trying to understand and measure ecosystem services. And we developed this one to try and think about one of the Aichi targets and how you would set indicators for ecosystem services using a more cyclical way and a more systems way of trying to do things. And the last one on the bottom is actually one that tries to combine all of these with the cyclical one as well, to try and get a better handle on maybe a systems lens on these conceptual frameworks. So we are seeing some traction for thinking about these things in quite practical ways. The next area is one where I think it's about how our programs are starting to expand their focus and their traction in the development arena. It's a bit of a strange graphic, but I'll try and explain it. Basically, what I've done here is I've put down two axes, one about the type of ecosystem service, provisioning, regulating, or cultural, and the other just looking at two kinds of benefits that people might get in the poverty context, specifically from ecosystem services. And we reviewed a whole bunch of development projects to try and explore where they were focusing, which kind of ecosystem services, even if they didn't use the word, and the kinds of benefits they were hoping to leverage through those interventions. And I've just put up 6 of the main clusters that we came across. Some of those will be very familiar to you. The kind of focus on provisioning services, either by enhancements in harvesting technologies and gear, things like school gardens and fisheries, improving subsistence benefits, and then ones that actually look at improving yields and markets, for example, in small-scale agriculture and the use of provisioning services. Then there's one that everyone's quite familiar with, the idea that you could actually unlock income for poor communities from improvements in regulating services, the payments for ecosystem service, and those are incredibly predominant in a lot of the projects and the literature. There's also a smaller group around the ideas of the fact that you could sell cultural services and actually generate income from things like nature-based tourism for local communities, and they're quite popular, and there's been quite a lot of work on that. But what also emerged from this review is some less well-known examples, for example, where local-scale improvements in regulating services are shedding local subsistence benefits for communities, both in terms of increases in productivity, but also decreases in vulnerability. And a big example here is the regreening work that goes on in the Sahel and the impacts that that has on subsistence benefits as well. And a final category is one that I think we keep kind of neglecting a little bit, is about restoring and revitalizing. Are you looking for seats? There are whole rows available in the front. So these kind of ecocultural projects look at restoring and revitalizing people's links, often in marginalized communities, to place and nature, and have been shown to have a wealth of benefits in terms of both improving social relations and well-being, but also things like empowering communities to be able to take on some mining enterprises in some of these. So a more nuanced idea, but also, and I think a rather underappreciated area of work in a lot of the work that we're doing in the development. And thinking through this kind of framework and also the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's really an opportunity for many of us to make sure that the ecosystem services community doesn't get shoehorned into the environment goals, the goals on land and oceans, and even the goals on climate. And, you know, sure, we should have some role to play in the food and water goals and thinking through those sorts of things and their interactions. But actually, if you start to think about the socio-cultural aspects of ecosystem services, a lot of the work that you're all involved in has benefits that range through things like education, equity, and health, where we don't see any sort of perception yet of the role of ecosystem services or the importance of the kind of work going on. And that, for me, is one of the challenges with this community faces with the SDGs, is to really make sure we do expand the relevance to the SDGs. Right, I think a third area where we're seeing the systems perspective becoming quite practical is, surprisingly enough, in the area of measurement. When a lot of people think about complex systems, there really is this perception that if you're going to want to measure a complex system, you need to measure everything about it, the components and their interactions and their feedbacks, before you can understand anything about it. And so this has generally tended to put people off the ideas of complex systems for measurement. But actually, I don't think this is the truth. And in fact, it turns out that our knowledge of these complex systems, like systems of the biosphere, systems of climate, and even the ocean systems, have allowed us to actually distill out the essential elements that capture the major dimensions of change that are relevant to these systems. And so we've seen this in the area of the essential climate variables, distilling out what are the key things that need to be measured about the climate system. We've just seen papers out on the essential biodiversity variables that do a similar thing. There's a set of essential ocean variables, and I believe there's a group working on identifying essential ecosystem service variables. And I think these kinds of thinking and the ideas that complex systems actually help us become more efficient in what we need to measure rather than magnify and multiply what we need to measure, have been taken a step forward by frameworks like the planetary boundaries and subsequent editions of the planetary boundaries, which have then worked to actually distill out what maybe are the essential planetary variables that require our attention and our measurement in order to keep the Earth in the sort of safe and inhabitable state that it currently is in. So I think one strength of these ideas about essential variables which come from our thinking on complex systems is the fact that they have the potential to reshape the way we see monitoring systems. So the figure there on your left is very much, I think, the way that many people are seeing the Sustainable Development Goals. A few goals, 17 goals, 169 targets, potentially 500 or so indicators, and who knows how many observations required to measure progress to those indicators. And this is an extremely depressing and disempowering message to nation states who currently are even struggling to measure the Millennium Development Goals. But actually, I think that what we're seeing with these ideas of essential variables is a shift towards the right there, a much more efficient and refined set of essential variables requiring measurement that can then inform an even smaller set of observations, which can in turn support a proliferation of indicators relevant to different policy contexts, because those policy contexts, which is what the SDGs are trying to do, are more aware about the cross-linkages between different policies and the trade-offs between different policy targets as well. So I think that this is potentially a very exciting area, thinking a little bit around these essential sustainability variables. And I think the ecosystem services agenda, the work going on there, has a lot to contribute here. And just as an example, in looking through some of the proposed indicators for things like the Sustainable Development Goals or the work that has gone on before them, we are seeing that people are recognizing a need to kind of combine measures of social and ecological. So on the bottom, we see the inclusive wealth as a composite measure where you measure the social, you measure the environment, you measure several other things, and you add them all together, divide them by a number, and that's your measure of a much better measure than GDP. There are also another set of measures which look at kind of efficiencies or rates, where they sort of separate out costs and benefits of a development scenario and can express things like crop yields by water consumption to give you an idea about the sustainability of that intervention. The challenge is that I think many of us are aware of in the room, this is still treating the social and the ecological as separate but comparable things. And we all know that we run into challenges there when we're trying to find common units or trying to divide something like an ecosystem service by a dollar value. But in fact, what we're seeing is some really exciting progress in these areas of more integrated measures and indicators, which don't combine the social and the ecological, they measure the social ecological. So they measure the interactions between human and ecosystems. These are just some examples from some PhD students of mine in South Africa who've been looking at the wonderfully diverse household survey and census data that are available at most national scales, and increasingly these days in global forms as well. And for example, here we're able to match and measure a dependence on ecosystem services, so a social dependence on an ecosystem. And we've also got two different measures here, which are about measuring a change in an ecosystem and what it means for the communities being surveyed. So that's a change in water quality and how communities are having to now boil or deal with the health impacts of water quality change. And this is an indicator that measures overutilization and degradation of natural resources that communities are dependent on. And then we also have some ones that are more possible at other scales, extracted from national statistics, looking at employment and income factors generated by ecosystem services. So these, as I said, these figures and these integrated indicators are not the kinds of data you can draw out from a data set on species diversity or one on ecosystem extent. They come from these more integrated survey databases like the Household Survey, South Africa's census data, and there's also a lot of these global survey databases now being curated by universities around the world. And there are quite a few links to those that I can also share after this talk. A final area of measurement that I think the systems perspective could really help us in is this idea of bundles or multiple ecosystem services. The idea that measuring single services is not necessarily the best way to go about things, but to think about multiple ecosystem services and how you might measure their interactions and trade-offs. And this is just a paper by Elena Bennett in 2009, who showed that there might be interactions in thinking about these systems of ecosystem services. There can be interactions between ecosystem services, and that's really important when we're thinking about trade-offs and synergies of management. But there are also interactions because they're being influenced by the same driver, either in the same direction or in opposite directions by a particular driver of change. And this kind of thinking and systems perspective has helped in approaches that now look at mapping and measuring and monitoring more the bundles of ecosystem services across space and across time. This is work from Quebec in Canada by Chiara Rodsep-Hearn. But more recently, it's been interesting to see this idea that ecosystem service bundles could actually be seen as emergent properties of social ecological systems and actually become useful in mapping things like ecosystem service dependence at a local scale through to a regional scale, which is work that one of my PhD students has recently published, mapping these areas of very high local ecosystem service dependence across a wide set of bundles of ecosystem services and looking at the interesting social context and drivers of those. And this links also to a recent paper by Graham Cumming, which looks terrible, but is actually very nice, on these ideas of green loop systems where there's a high dependence on local ecosystem services all the way through to red loop systems where you're looking at urban communities who've disconnected themselves from local ecosystem services and have kind of exported their footprint and dependence. And it's looking at agricultural to urban transitions, which I think is very interesting in the African context, certainly looking at the urbanization scenarios there and thinking of how a systems perspective has helped to map and measure these kinds of transitions and dependence. Okay, so that's the system perspective, thinking about interactions and feedbacks. And just a reminder to myself what I've just said. We were looking at the sort of theories of these interactions and feedbacks and the fact that they're having traction in things like conceptual frameworks in our expanded ability to engage with different kinds of development programs, all the way from provisioning services through to cultural services and their benefits. Some of the ideas around measurement, around these essential variables and more integrated indicators coming from the ecosystem services community. And finally, these ideas of measuring multiple ecosystem services and thinking hard about trade-offs and synergies, which are extremely relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals as they become implemented. So the next bit I wanted to talk about, if everyone's still awake, sort of looks like it. Okay, good. Is about change. And change is very exciting, so hopefully it'll keep you awake until the end of the talk. And this is both to think about change, both the kind of slow change that many of us think about in our models and our work, as well as more sudden, surprising change. And I think that most of us sitting in this room are very comfortable with the idea of variability in the systems that we work with. We know that change is the only constant, really. This is just a graph that looks at the last 100,000 years of climate-interpreted data, and it shows that we don't exactly live in a stable world, so ideas of equilibrium, stability, and predictability kind of go out the window. And I think we've become comfortable with this. We've looked at models that can help us think about this in our work, and it certainly is an important component to work with. But I think one of the things that the systems perspective introduces that we think about a little less is the fact that change is not always linear. Change is often nonlinear because of the feedbacks and interactions and the presence of what are called slow variables in many of these systems. There often are thresholds of change beyond which change becomes a lot faster and often irreversible. And these are concepts that have been taken forward in things like the planetary boundaries, which aims to identify what some of these tipping points or thresholds might be in things like the climate system, the biosphere, and ocean acidification. And they certainly are something that are central to a systems way of understanding the world. The idea that we can't just expect climate to increase by 0.5 degrees in a period of time, but that actually you have tipping points around ice sheets, albedo, etc., and the feedbacks from those into the global climate system that would then speed up the rate of climate change. This brings with it the idea of regime shifts, which sounds like a political term, but it's not. It's an ecological term that is used a lot in the sort of resilience thinking and community. And it's really this idea that a system, a social ecological system, can exist in many different configurations. And of relevance to us is that each of those configurations would then provide a different bundle of ecosystem services. And what determines the configuration or the regime that a particular system exists in is a combination of a slow variable like a driver of change like land use or eutrophication of a water body, combined with internal dynamics and feedbacks of that system. So you may find that a system like a clear lake is the common example, has an increasing nutrient load dumped in it from agriculture in surrounding areas and wastewater, and suddenly it reaches a threshold where it is no longer a clear lake and is a eutrophied lake, which produces a very different bundle of ecosystem services. Now, even if you stop that nutrient load entering the water, and even if you clear that nutrient load from the water, the chances of reversing that are very low because the internal system dynamics and feedbacks then lock it into this new state. It becomes a new kind of system. And so this is something that I think has been thought of a lot in the sort of social ecological systems and resilience communities. And there's some really nice databases now. There's a thing called the Regime Shifts Database, which has been put together by UNC Biggs at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, another South African. And it now has pulled together regime shifts and evidence for those from around the world and is allowing the analysis of those regime shifts. Here's an example of some work that recently came out in the Proceedings journal. And it looks at what the major drivers, if anyone can read that writing. These are mostly things like Arctic sea ice, marine food webs, hypoxia, coral transitions that have been the major causes of many of these regime shifts, and whether those things are managed at global scales in the yellow, national levels in the blue, and green showing more local scales of intervention around those regime shifts. So this is a very interesting area. At the moment, it's quite ecological in its work and very focused on a certain set of ecosystem services, and I know there's a lot of interest in trying to grow these into more sort of social ecological regimes and looking at some of the social drivers that may actually be causing some of these shifts. And just to add to the kind of theory and underpinnings behind a lot of this work on variability and change is this notion that we're no longer sitting in a world that we were sitting in, say, 50 years ago. This is Will Stephan's slide on the Great Acceleration, looking at the massive uptick of figures like population. This is where you see them go up is the 1950s, population, consumption figures. There's even one here on the number of McDonald's restaurants. And then also these are the figures of biodiversity loss and environmental change and climate change. So just showing really a situation where we're now sitting in a fundamentally different world. Many are calling it the Anthropocene. An idea that we now have a much more globally connected world where the rate and pace and scale of change is fundamentally different from the world that we've been in the past. And I think that this then sort of raises the bar even further for those of us trying to think about how this is relevant to our work and how we can bring in new approaches and make this idea of change and uncertainty more tractable in our work. So this is a slide that I saw at one of the keynotes at one of these conferences, really thinking about change and the fact that we're dealing with sort of a lot of what we already know, some of what we know we don't know, and some unknown unknowns that we don't know, and thinking a little bit about how we could make that practical in our work. And so here are just a few ideas, I think, for making it practical as I round up into the last 5 minutes. Okay. So how we make this idea of change a little bit more tractable in our work? Well, there's this fantastic book that's just come out called The Principles of Resilience. It's also in a paper and a brochure, and it really tries to distill out 7 principles and evidence for how we can actually build capacity to deal with change and unexpected change in the systems in which we work. And 3 of those principles, I think, are really relevant to the work that we do, both in terms of how we can grow this ability to think about systems in the way we do, to encourage learning, and to broaden participation. And actually, they're all quite strongly linked to each other. And one of the ways I think we can do it is through the use of models. Rather than having someone like me stand up and give a presentation to the General Assembly of the UN on why systems thinking is relevant, we actually can work together in participatory ways using tools like models. I've covered the slide with lots of drafts because it's an IP-based deliverable that I was able to get hold of yesterday, but it's still in review. And it really looks at the fact that there's so many different kinds of models. I think we have a very narrow interpretation of the models we work with, but this is the policy cycle that goes from agenda setting to design to implementation to review. And this is a slide that kind of shows that you have models that allow you to dialogue for agenda setting, models that allow you to prioritize and design, tactical models for response and implementation, and then models for learning. And the same review looks a lot at the various models available in the ecosystem services world that many of us are using, and how these might be relevant to several of those stages of the policy cycle. And this has certainly been our experience in work in South Africa, where we are using models a lot, but not just to generate results or try and predict futures, but actually as learning tools embedded in processes like a resilience assessment. And also this is the process used by the Natural Capital Project for using their models for designing decision support and products from that. And so this is just a slide that shows it a bit more. There's a 4-step process we use from the resilience assessment, and in each of those there's a modeling category that we use in working together with stakeholders. And although these models are very exciting and we have a lot of fun with them, some of them are really good and some of them are really sketchy, it's been interesting to note that actually the findings seem to be less relevant than the amount of systems thinking that they generate in the groups that we're working with. This is an example in working with the insurance industry and the brewery industry in South Africa, really flagging the far distant systems connections that many of their operations have to water and extreme event scenarios. And these are just some of the interesting findings coming out from that work, really helping stakeholders think about how much bigger the world really is than it is, but how much leverage and power you have to act in collaborative ways, not really by yourself. Okay, I won't go through that one. And this is really just one of the last points I wanted to make, was that many of us are working in these kind of deeply participatory ways around learning and fostering systems thinking in the development arena. I've just got some slides here. That's from our work in South Africa at the bottom, but also working in the development planning space in Mozambique, the water security area in South Africa, and even with development bank investments. And I think that these offer us large opportunities, not only to use ecosystem service as a concept, but to also foster greater systems thinking in many of these development investments and their eventual role in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I'll end with this slide, which is a bit of an adaptation of Steve Carpenter's slide, pretty much about how I think a lot of our models and our scenarios and our processes for working are helping us to work with stakeholders to understand both known unknowns and also become comfortable in coping with and even thriving with unknown unknowns. I think there's still a little bit of a challenge if we start thinking about unknowable unknowns, but maybe that's something we can leave for the discussion after this. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Belinda. I really enjoyed that.
You sound surprised.
No, really, it's a great start to the conference. I think you've helped to rewire my brain a little bit more effectively than it was before we started. You've boiled things down, but in a way that adds value, and I think set the tone for the conference, and actually presented some possible ways in which we might think about synthesis of the breadth of work. So we have 15 minutes for questions, for comments. What has Belinda inspired you to think about? Any different viewpoints? We could take possibly 2 or 3 points. Who'd like to start? Yes, please. Name, and then your brief comment or question.
Robert Nichols from the University of Southampton. Very nice talk. I think I agree with you entirely about the modelling aspect that intrigued me. But then I wonder, and I grapple with this myself, how do you deal with sort of competing models? Because in fact, the problems you're talking about are very complex, and if we say imagine a thought experiment of having, say, 3 different groups independently working on the same problem, they'd probably come up with 3 different models, and they might have quite different behaviours, and so, and yet the use of policy is about confidence. So how do we get over that hump in what are very complex systems compared to many of the systems we've modelled historically?
Thanks, Robert. Others? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Carlos Torres, also from the University of Southampton. Thanks for the lecture, it was very interesting. I'm a sociologist, so my question is a big question, but sorry for that. You use a lot the term social systems. Coming from the sociological, anthropological tradition, talking about social systems is a bit controversial. Actually, the term has not been in favor for a few decades already, because it assumes that actors have specific roles, so there is a unidimensional representation of actors, that societies have a functional system, and that they have kind of a regulatory system. It's something that doesn't work when you analyze societies and communities from an historical perspective. So my question would be, if you can expand a bit more, what do you mean by social systems in your presentation? Thank you.
Thanks. One more? Yes.
Hello, I'm Heijs Gaasma, also the University of Southampton. I have a question about your socio-ecological systems and the drivers of change. And in particular, I was interested in social drivers indeed. And I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more on the impact of poverty and inequality in driving change and what kind of variable that is in the system change.
Thank you. I'll come back, Katherine. Belinda? Sorry? It's linked. Okay.
It's linked, and also I had to break the University of Southampton monopoly. Catherine Homewood from University College London. I was interested in what you were saying about social ecological indicators. And this links to the last question about poverty. Because in the areas where I work, there are quite good official data and surveys on a significant part of the population, which those nations take to represent the whole nation. But actually the poorest, who are indeed the sector that we are thinking about to some extent, are completely invisible in those official statistics. And I won't say any more than that, but how do you deal with that in your social ecological indicators? Thank you.
Great. So I think these were all incredibly important questions and comments and are big challenges for this area of work. I don't think I can pretend to answer any of them, but maybe I could further the conversation. I think that the idea of these conflicting models is certainly something we've come across before. In fact, some of our programs, the stakeholders have brought very different models to the table from the models we have, and they may not agree. But I mean, I do think that this is the fundamental part about knowledge co-production and working together. And I would be surprised in the sort of systems context if models did agree. I suppose there's some essential dimensions where they may agree. If it's just the sort of size and scale and it's about a confidence interval or a certainty limit. In some of the programs we worked on, we actually started rather using the stakeholders models because of the length and the traction that those had within stakeholders. I think it is a little bit this idea that uncertainty and conflict have to be well-facilitated processes in any of these kinds of assessments and processes, because as I said, I'm not surprised that there are conflicting models. I imagine that there's a lot of conflict between different sort of more scientific models, but the real challenge often comes in when there's a stakeholder model. For example, our water sector uses a very different model and set of data sets from the models being used by hydrologists in academia. And that was like a 5-year process of moving towards a point of convergence there and agreement in the outcomes and the learning from that. So, you know, I think, I'm not sure, Christo, if this is something you'll be talking about tomorrow around contestation in the co-production process. But you might have a few comments to make on that too. The next Southampton question on social systems, I mean, certainly I come at this from a very natural sciences perspective. That is my training. I'm now working more with people in these interdisciplinary spaces, so I knew I was going to use words in the incorrect way. I think I was just trying to express them in the way that they're seen in these embedded ideas of human systems and environment systems, and I hope I haven't caused confusion from that. I do think the points you raised around agency and actors, and governance and institutions are critical components that are brought into the systems perspective. I didn't get to them, I could say because of the time, but also just because they're not my strength. But I do think that as part of this evolving conversation, it would be really nice to think about how those may or may not be relevant in this idea of systems and sustainable development and the role of ecosystem services. So that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's a very valid point. Your question was about social drivers, and what about them again?
Poverty and inequality, what kind of drivers of change they are, kind of slow variables?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that there's been some interesting work on equity and inequity, really, or inequality as a driver. I haven't really thought about it. I mean, I imagine it's also not linear, but I haven't thought about it in terms of its speed or its impacts. It would certainly be something interesting to look into. I know that there's been some interesting work looking at kind of prosperity versus equity measures used in tracking sustainable development and showing how different those two are and how they don't really overlap very much, which I think links to your point around the data sets and how they miss the most important communities. I think, you know, what we've been very fortunate in the South African census is it is a well-stratified and well-designed process to capture. There are some questions, however, that we wish they would ask that they don't ask. I do see, you know, there is a risk in all our data sets, national statistics too, that people are relying on for food production. You know, our FAO statistics are notoriously flawed, and we're making some big decisions on those. So I think, you know, there are some efforts at the moment around these livelihood surveys and setting up best practice guidelines in terms of both how you sample and who you sample, which may address some of these challenges. But other than that, I can't really think, I haven't really thought about how to deal with it. We have household survey data in South Africa that's pretty amazing and is aiming to surface a lot of these poverty issues and actually does target those households. But I'm pretty sure that isn't the situation everywhere. So it would be an interesting thing to think about is how does one deal with those kinds of data gaps that are probably hiding the most important patterns that we need to elucidate in this work.
Thanks, Belinda. Time for a couple more comments. Thoughts? Yeah, hi.
Thank you. I am John Adeoti from the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, Ibadan. So, well, Belinda, I want to say your talk has been quite illuminative, and it's a very brilliant one. The issue I want to raise has to do with the issue of complex systems. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, what we try to do is to make things as simple as possible so that every stakeholders in development can relate with them. And eventually, we're able to make choices that will ensure that we achieve those goals. From your presentation, how can we make these complex systems simpler such that everyone can relate with them? And even as researchers, as scientists, you find that the issue of competing models, we can't avoid it. There will always be competing models. But when it comes to choosing, making choices, okay, if things remain so complex, it's a whole lot of problem, okay? So it makes choices difficult, and in terms of making impacts, you find that there will be a lot of constraints. So complex systems, the way you presented them, do you have some ideas on how to make them simpler such that everyone can relate with them, and eventually when we begin to relate them to SDGs, so that we can actually make some significant impacts? Thank you.
Thanks, John. One more.
Thank you.
Wasn't me.
Hear me?
Hey, this mic isn't well, someone's blowing their noses.
It's not me.
Okay.
It's working.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation.
There might be feedback.
Just stand up and
Just
talk loudly.
Just stand up and shout.
So I think on both those points, I really did not mean to say that we should simplify complex systems. The point I'm making is we need to make them practical and operational, the perspective. So I think in reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, I wouldn't suggest we need to simplify complex systems to make them relevant to the SDGs, but actually the system perspective can help simplify and rationalize the implementation of the SDGs by thinking much more about the interactions between goals and the trade-offs between targets as well. So, I think in the work that we're doing at a national level, we're actually able to use a complex systems understanding to distill those goals and targets into a set of 6 achievable goals and maybe a set of 10 indicators to measure those goals. And so that's really what I'm suggesting, is thinking about the interactions and trade-offs between goals using a systems perspective would say, well, for the food goal to work and the water goal to work, these are the things we're going to have to do. The fact that water isn't mentioned in the food goal has been something that we've been trying to push from the systems understanding, that you can't think about food production without thinking about water, and so on and so forth. So that was more my interpretation. So I'm not suggesting we simplify a complex system. A complex system is complex, but our understanding and our learning about complex systems from the last 2 decades can certainly be helpful in making operational and rationalizing and making more efficient the implementation of things like the SDGs. And I think in a similar way to your question there in the back around these really key social factors that we keep forgetting about in our work on ecosystem services, this is really why we're pushing back from a systems perspective on the fact that an ecosystem provides an ecosystem service which a society then uses. Issues such as access, tenure, rights, all those things that you raised really do shape the way that an ecosystem service is produced and also who it benefits. And I think that those are some really strong points that we're trying to put forward with the systems perspective.
Thanks, Belinda, again. Just a brief thought from me. I mean, having spoken to various people in developing countries now faced with the task of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, on the one hand they say, my goodness, 169 targets. On the other they say, well, actually in government we have thousands of targets, so potentially there's a simplification, a rationalization here. I think they've almost all been resistant to systems thinking because it seemed very abstract and academic. Now I believe there's an appetite, a bit of a curiosity, and I think some of what you've offered this morning would be a helpful guide into thinking about systems to make relevant decisions. That's what they need to make. It all needs to be decision-focused rather than baffled by the complexity. So, Belinda, you've set us off really well. That was a wonderful talk. A bit more of a round of applause.